It began with the buzz of phones as the news alerts hit. Gasps and cries went up from the students scattered around the study lounge. Byron ignored it. Though it was early in the morning, he assumed the alert was some ridiculous bit of sports news or another breaking political scandal. If he had been working on his tablet, he would have seen it, but he was the old-fashioned type that liked to sketch in a paper notepad, though his final works always ended up digital. "Oh my God!" exclaimed a girl across the room, her voice choking as she covered her mouth. Byron shook his head, vaguely annoyed at the inconsiderate noise, which was quickly growing into hushed murmurs across the lounge. He took a sip of his coffee and bent closer to his sketchbook. "Professor Newley," a meek voice behind him said. He sighed and looked up at the student beside him. "What is it?" he huffed. "Professor Newley, didn't you see?" said the nervous young man, his phone clutched in his left hand. His eyes were watery and his face aghast. Byron realized the eyes of every student in the lounge were on him. He looked around and noticed some with their arms around each other, girls with multicolored hair holding back sobs, and one boy so angry that he seemed ready to punch the tabletop in front of him. Byron retrieved his phone from his back pocket, the screen automatically lighting up at his touch. Several news alerts were being pushed to the bottom of his notifications as message after message replaced them. "Byron, I'm so sorry. I can't believe it. Did you see?" He scrolled down quickly with his thumb, his heart suddenly pounding and a feeling of dread sinking into his body, making his limbs grow cold. Finally, he saw the original alert, and his breath caught in his throat. Damon Jack had died, age 69. Damon Jack's compound reminded Byron of an attraction at a theme park. With its slick, jet-black glass exterior formed of interconnected boxes, it was hard to imagine that the great man himself not only lived his day-to-day life there, but also created some of his most important work within those intimidating walls. It was well known that in the basement of the house there was a studio in which he had created his most seminal pieces, and though Byron had never even seen pictures of the space, few had, he assumed it to be immense due to the sheer size of the work Damon had produced. Byron had stood outside this building many times as a younger man, hoping to catch a glimpse of the master himself, but he never had. The gate that surrounded the property was unchanged, but the trees and shrubs that grew up beside the ultra-modern structure seemed more unkempt than he remembered. Carefully, he punched in the code he'd been given into a box by the side of the gate, causing the latch to unlock itself and swing open for him. These were not the circumstances he had hoped for when entering the house of his idol, and though it had been a few weeks since the news of Damon Jack's death, the thought overwhelmed Byron for a moment. His throat closed up a tiny bit as he stepped onto the shiny onyx paving stones that led to the house. The front steps were a stark white marble juxtaposed against the black glass of the house. Byron noticed an odd glitter on the ground as he approached the steps. He bent down and picked up the shiny piece of black glass. Glancing to his left, he saw that one of the overgrown shrubs was obscuring a section of glass that had been replaced by a large wooden board. Curious, Byron took a step toward the section. A large, dark spot marred the brightness of the marble directly beneath where the glass should have been, and as Byron looked closer, he realized more dark spots led away from the largest one. His mind started to delve into dark places, images of glass slicing through flesh so vivid that he felt slightly nauseous. Was this how he died? He wondered. The official report hadn't said, and the records had all been kept sealed by some miracle, so no one had any idea what had happened to Damon Jack. There were rumors, of course, whispers of hidden illness and shadowy figures scheming to get at his money, and even though police confirmed that there was no foul play involved in his death, It still added fuel to the theory of something sinister being hushed up. Byron hadn't believed a word of it, but of course, he had wondered. Byron tore himself away from the mystery of the broken glass and the dark spots on the marble and approached the front of the house. He could just discern the outline of a pair of doors, side by side, and paneled in black glass so as to blend seamlessly into the facade. There were no handles with which to open the doors, and no visible intercom or doorbell to ring. As Byron held his hand up uncertainly to knock, a tonal sound echoed, then a static scratch, and finally a woman's voice saying, "Who's there?" "Miss, my name is Byron Newley. I've come from Ambrose University about Mr. Jack's archives." There was another sound like a whimper or a sigh, then a click from the door as one of them opened a crack. "In the parlor," said the woman's voice, followed by more static, and finally a small electronic screech. Byron took a deep breath, studying his own terrified face in the shiny glass of the door. Though he had shaved that morning, the train ride down from the university had been delayed several times, making the journey longer than he had anticipated, and his dark golden beard was beginning to show through. He ran a quick hand over his slicked-back, wheat-colored hair, hoping to tame away wayward strands before opening the door and stepping into the house of his dead hero. Voices were suddenly all around him. Everywhere, people in long coats and gloves were handling objects like vases or statuettes or typing into tablets. Some were rushing up and down the staircase on the left. None of them seemed to notice Byron at all as they chatted to each other or into their devices. Looking behind him, Byron recognized the glass walls as the kind specifically tempered to allow in light by remote control, meaning it could shift color and opacity on demand. He'd seen something like it in a demonstration once, but never on this kind of scale. The furnishings in this area of the house were sparse, almost like a gallery, with just a few white bench-like pieces scattered throughout and harsh track lighting directed at various points on the walls. Unsure of where to go, Byron managed to catch the attention of one of the men who had been scanning an ornate floor vase. "Can you tell me where the parlor is?" he asked. The man pointed to a passageway on the right, then turned back to his work. Feeling uneasy, Byron headed in the direction the man had indicated, pulling at the collar of his button-down shirt and smoothing the lapels of his navy blue blazer. After about 20 feet, the passageway opened into a dimly lit red room. On one side, a full-size, twisting tree appeared to be growing from a planter and into the ceiling. A collection of boxy-shaped black leather furniture dominated the other side of the room. All of it faced towards the tree, as though in contemplation of it. Seated in one of the black leather chairs was a woman, with her knees pulled up to her chest, and her long dark hair obscuring her face. "Miss," Byron said softly, Are you Jade?" The woman looked up at him. She had a round, pale face like a full moon, a long nose, pointed chin, and large, dark eyes. "I'm sorry to be so informal," Byron said, half bowing to the woman. "They didn't give me a last name." As he looked at her again, a shock of recognition ran through him. He knew this face. But from where? The realization unsteadied him for a moment. Not only had he seen this woman's face, but he had studied it extensively. She was the subject of a series of Damon Jack's paintings known collectively as the Melancholy Girl, depicting the same moon-faced woman in various poses and colors and 10-foot-tall portraits. Though not particularly well regarded amongst the critics of the time, Byron had always felt a strange affection for the set of paintings, because of the haunting quality of the woman's expression and the curious, faint religious symbolism Damon had hidden in the background of each one. No mention had ever been made of who the model for the pieces might have been, and Damon himself always dodged the question with a wry smile or an obscure comment. "You can call me Jade, Mr. Newley," said the woman softly. She gestured to the leather couch beside her. I can't take you downstairs while these people are here. They told me they'll be finished soon. Who are they? Byron asked as he awkwardly took a seat. Appraisal experts. They're taking stock of everything to come up with an estimated value of the estate so the turnover can be finalized. The woman, Jade, had a cracked, tired voice, mirrored by her exhausted appearance. She wore a loose-fitting, smock-like shirt that seemed to be splattered in various colors of paint over a tight-fitting tank top and a pair of linen trousers. Her ensemble of dark clothing oddly reminded Byron of a Catholic nun. Her bare feet rested on an ottoman, with her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped tightly around them. She looked like a petulant teenager, but taking the age of the paintings into account, Byron guessed that she had to be in her late 20s or early 30s at the very least. Damon left his estate in your care, is that right? He asked carefully. She nodded without looking at him. Do you mind if I ask? That is, if it's not too personal, Byron began, then stopped, worried of offending the woman. She gazed at him evenly, neither encouraging nor discouraging. Are you related to Damon Jack? Byron asked finally, trying his best to be tactful. She sighed, turning away from him. I was his... she started. Byron's mind raced through the possibilities. Daughter? Lover? Assistant? Nurse? Apprentice, I suppose you could say, she finally said. Byron nodded, his hands clasped between his knees. I am so sorry for your loss. I really can't tell you how much his work meant to me, he said. I've been such an admirer of his since I was a child, really. It seems unreal that he's gone. He was truly one of the greatest painters that ever lived. The woman nodded again, still looking away from Byron and towards the twisted tree. Is that why they sent you? Because you were a fan? She asked. Yes, I suppose, Byron responded, bristling a little at the implication that he was merely some obsessed civilian. I wrote my doctorate thesis on Damon Jack, and I teach supplementary courses on him to the design students. My colleagues at the university knew I had accumulated a lot of knowledge about his work and career, so it seemed right that I should be the one to sort and document his archives. I can't tell you how grateful we are that he decided to leave his archives to us. By the way, I think it will be a real benefit to the students and scholars. One of the long-coated estate appraisers appeared at the entrance of the parlor. Jade stood up without a word and approached the man, who held out his tablet to show her something. She was taller than Byron had first thought, probably near 6 foot, with squared-off shoulders, a strong torso, and long, thin limbs that looked almost alien. In the dim light, it was difficult to tell the exact color of her hair, whether it was deep red, brown, or even black. She listened wordlessly as the man ran through the findings of his fellows and details of where that information would be delivered, not even looking up at him, but keeping her gaze focused on his tablet. With a few nods and an awkward handshake, the man finally left. Jade stood on the spot, looking down the passageway at what Byron assumed was the group of people trooping out of the house. Thank God they've gone, she murmured, seemingly to herself. I couldn't stand watching them pawing over his things a moment longer. There was a long, uncomfortable moment of silence as she continued to stare off towards the front entrance of the house, her face now waning in the dim light. Come with me, Mr. Newley. I'll show you downstairs, she said at last, and began to leave the room before Byron even had a chance to stand up. Quickly following her through the long passageway that seemed to run the length of the house, he barely had time to take notice of anything. Byron wanted so much to take everything in, from the stark design of the furnishings to the stunning abstract light fixtures, to the eclectic art that hung on the walls, and all the little signs of life that populated each room. He lived here. He walked these halls. touch these things, he kept thinking, as they continued briskly further and further toward the back of the house. Jade stopped at what appeared to be a gaping hole in the ground and waited for Byron to catch up. Though they were roughly the same height, she had seemed to move so much quicker than he did, those unsettlingly long legs of hers gliding over the granite floors like a spider treading water. Jade flipped a switch on the wall, and the hole lit up. Byron realized it was a spiraling staircase made from clear plastic and wire so as to be almost invisible, leading down so far that all he could see of the bottom was darkness. He followed Jade cautiously, unnerved by the flimsy feeling of the railing in his hand and the lightness of the material beneath his feet. She reached the floor when he was about halfway down, and moving off into the darkness, she flipped another switch that sent an electrical buzzing through the air. One by one, large industrial lights began to illuminate the place in an unnatural blue-tinged whiteness. Byron paused on the staircase to look around in awe. The space was massive, the size of a theater, with scaffolding all along one wall. The floor was bare stone, splattered in every color imaginable, and various work tables and materials had been set up at random intervals. Byron looked up at the top of the massive blank wall and saw a complex system of hooks and pulleys attached to black ropes that ran to the ground. This, he realized, was Damon Jack's fabled studio, the place where he had created the massive canvas murals he had made his name on. Damon Jack was a great painter in the old style. Most artists had long ago forsaken physical materials, choosing to exclusively create their works through the use of digital tools and software. Things like oil paints, mounted canvas, and horsehair brushes were a thing of the past, and had become increasingly hard to find, being abandoned in favor of sophisticated electronic devices that could create any color, texture, or brushstroke on command. Indeed, the age of electronic art had taken out almost all handmade arts, as the history books called them. Learning to play a single physical instrument was considered a waste of time, when one could just as easily acquaint themselves with a program that could bring an entire orchestra to one's fingertips. Why spend millions building sets and hiring unstable actors, when a team of programmers could create the same fantastical cinematic worlds in the safety of a studio-monitored workroom? Why paint a portrait when a photograph could be more easily manipulated to show perfection or evoke the right emotion? The pursuit of a handmaid was generally considered trivial, a wasted hobby, and not for those who were serious about their art. This was why the students, and even Byron's fellow professors, shook their heads with amusement when they saw him scribbling in his notebooks with nubs of charcoal. He even tried to teach these methods to his students until the materials became too hard to find. Byron liked the idea of handmaids, but he also knew enough about the digital arts to comfortably live in both worlds. When Damon Jack had first made a name for himself some 50 years ago, his paintings were not as unusual as they had become. There had still been plenty of artists who had worked in traditional mediums, as well as those who were venturing into the digital realms, but as time went on, most of them either died off or changed to adapt to shifting technologies. Not Damon Jack, though. Ever the rebel, he refused to give up on his craft and began creating his works on bigger and bigger scales. Huge murals that dominated with their sheer size, many so big they couldn't be displayed inside galleries and had to be hung instead from the sides of buildings. Once, he had even started a project that had him touring his works by transforming the skylines of different cities into his own personal galleries, creating custom pictures fitted to the architecture of each structure. There were some more traditionally sized paintings as well, but it was his brazenness in creating art so big that it can't be ignored, as he put it, that had earned him the distinction of public appreciation on a larger scale than any of his contemporaries. Perhaps this was why his sudden death had triggered an almost unprecedented worldwide grief, on par with the loss of a great political leader or religious figure. Beyond his mischievous, sneering charm, his otherworldly countenance, and his knack for straddling the line between mainstream appeal and underground sensibilities. The loss of Damon Jack was felt so profoundly because most people realized there literally would never be another artist like him again. "Are you coming, Mr. Newley?" came the slightly exasperated voice of Jade at the bottom of the staircase. Byron felt dizzy trying to take in the enormity of the space around him. "I'm sorry, yes, I'm coming," he said, and shakily made his way down. "This way," she said as he set foot on solid ground, his hard-soled shoes sounding a dull thud on the stone floor. "This is a little overwhelming for me," said Byron, once again rushing after her while trying to take in the details of his current environment. Being here where he worked, where he created such important pieces, I'd try to imagine just how big it would be, but I had no idea. Is the studio the size of the entire house above? "Yes," said Jade. "The studio was built first, then the house on top of it. On top of this space is actually just above ground level. The house only appears to be on level with the street, when in reality, it's actually one floor up." "Amazing," Byron breathed, letting his focus linger on a raised dais towards the center of the floor, which was surrounded by several large shapes draped in dust-covered tarps. "Mr. Newley," said Jade sharply, startling Byron out of his reverie. He gasped with surprise as he nearly ran into her. He could see her more clearly now under the harsh lights of the studio, and he was surprised to find that she had sharp and glittering violet silver eyes. "Sorry," he muttered. They stood in front of a large vault-like door that had a scanner box and an elaborate-looking lock on it. Jade held out her phone, and the scanner seemed to recognize something on it as the door released and swung open. Jade gestured for Byron to enter the room first, which he did with an obliging nod. With a flick of a switch, another set of industrial lights buzzed into being, and Byron found himself in a long, low-ceilinged room this time, filled as far as he could see with shelving units. Some housed hard drives, others black binders of materials, and on others, leather-bound books. There was every kind of media imaginable: ancient video cassettes, vinyl albums, tiny modern flash drives, barely the size of a fingernail, that could be scanned with a phone or a tablet and instantly relay their information to the waiting device. "He kept everything," Jade said with a sigh. "Every half-formed idea, every scribble, every thought he had ever had. On that side you'll find his journals." "His journals? He wrote them by hand?" "Yes." "My God, I can barely find sketch pads to work in these days." Jade ignored Byron's astonishment. "On that side, you will find most everything to do with his works. His schematics and design outlines, his sketches, videos of him at work." She trailed off after a sharp intake of breath. Byron ripped his attention away from the treasury in front of him to look at her. She had become overwhelmed with emotion, unable to speak. He made to approach her, but she held up her hand and warned him with a stern look. "Your sympathy is appreciated but not necessary, Mr. Newley," she said after a moment, her eyes still watery and threatening to overflow. "Can I ask how long you knew him?" Byron asked gently. She took a deep breath. "More than half my life," she responded. "Though what I had before he came along could hardly be considered a life at all. He was everything to me, Mr. Newley, and I don't know if you have ever experienced something like the loss of your whole world. More than a mentor, more than a father. Everything." "I'm so sorry," was all Byron could think to say. The grief he had felt for the loss of his idol suddenly seemed trivial and worthless in the face of someone who had known him as a man and not as an artist, and it made him feel guilty and ashamed, like a gawker at a stranger's funeral. "Please know that I will treat his things with the utmost care. I am devoted to preserving everything so that his genius will continue to inspire generations of artists like he has inspired me." She seemed to look at him differently for a moment. "Are you an artist, Mr. Newley?" she asked. He flushed. I'd like to think I am," he said. She studied him intensely now, her jaw stiffened and her gaze steady. "How long do you think it will take to catalog all of this?" she asked, making a sweeping gesture at the room at large. Byron shook his head. "Weeks, perhaps several months. I won't know how much there is to do until I get into it." She nodded. "You'll need lodging then," she said. "I suppose so. I'll be going back to the university tonight to draw up a list of things I'll need for the project, so I can discuss it with them tomorrow, and I can have a room set up for you in the house," said Jade, matter-of-factly. "There's a small but efficient staff employed here, so you'll be able to concentrate on your work and not have to worry about commuting or food. Then the university can allocate their budget fully to the best equipment." Byron nodded, befuddled. "If you're sure, I wouldn't want to impose," he said uncertainly. "It'll be the easiest thing so that I'm not having to worry about you coming and going. I intend to be here working in the studio most every day, so we can keep an eye on each other." She smiled oddly to herself, and Byron wondered if this wasn't her attempt at making a joke. "Besides, the house is big enough that should I wish to avoid you, I can." "Do you live here?" Byron asked. "This is my property now, Mr. Newley," she said, suddenly authoritative. "Even if I hadn't lived here since I was a teenager, do you think I'd let you lodge here without me being on the premises? As though this were some sort of boarding house?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that." She held him in the stern gaze of a disapproving headmistress, making Byron shrink slightly from the woman he was sure he was at least a decade older than. "How long do you think your assessment will take?" she asked, looking away from him at last. "I should only need an hour or so, and then I'll be out of your hair for today," Byron responded. "I have work to do. I'll be in the studio should you need me," she said, and moved to leave. "A word of caution, Mr. Newley," she said over her shoulder without looking at him directly. "If your goal is to canonize a saint, you won't find any proof of miracles here. Stay objective." She turned and walked out, leaving the heavy door barely open behind her.